Hi, my name's Dakota Allen, and I worked with Jack Boynton, Spencer Dooley, and Brett Meyer, and we modeled the spread of trends.
So our research question is, how does the spread of a trend change on networks of varying amounts of physical and virtual connections? So the way we're going to depict this is looking at essentially different times in history. So we're going to model a pre-social media era, we're going to model an early social media era, and basically now, and we're going to vary the amount of virtual connections that each person has. So, right, why on earth do we care about this? We can use these methods to see like how things would spread at different times, to see maybe why past marketing strategies or trends were successful or failure. A great example of a successful trend is or a marketing campaign is Old Spice, and the way Old Spice is said to come back was they actually just basically marketed to the correct target audience, and then figured that actually women buy most men's body wash, which is interesting. And if we think about current day, like why do we still care about this? Maybe we want to target different age groups or just demographics of the population. And this interesting paper found that if we look at travel advertisements, for looking at travel, women consult social media more than men. And interestingly, women and men use different social media platforms. So men use LinkedIn more than women, and women use Pinterest more than men. And women were more swayed on activities based on pictures and videos they saw on social media, and men were more swayed by reviews and transportation related advertisements. So say you were Delta Airlines, you might want to target LinkedIn, for example. Or if you are an outing company, you might want to target Pinterest, where you're going to have a nice picture advertisement. So just a little bit of background on what's been done. Just remember the Strogatz and Watts model, or paper. Remember, if we started with a regular network where everyone's just kind of connected to their neighbors, we have a very long path to get across the network. But if you recall, we have this graph as it goes across, that it only takes a couple of random connections to get what they call that small world network, where the shortest path across the network really starts to change and really starts to get a lot smaller. So that's kind of what we're going to investigate here, is do we see something similar as we change the amount of virtual connections in the networks. And then just looking at what's been done in the research literature is basically there's a lot of work on looking at optimal spreading and or seeding, right? So that's basically right what we would be looking at is how to do spreading a trend, but just optimally. But a lot of these methods are only done on social networks. And one of the ones I think is really cool is a paper looking at profit maximization, and it actually shows that the spreading of a trend is different than optimizing the profit of a trend. And because when you look at profit, you have to account for the costs associated with seeding at different nodes. But basically, just what this paper finds is that selecting the highest degree nodes is not always the most optimal method. So, but again, these only account for social networks. So, would we expect to find a similar trend when we actually consider physical connections, not just social ones?
So looking at some of the basic assumptions we built our model around, we started by assuming an individual can be put in one of three states when looking at the spread of a trend. An individual is either unaware of the trend, aware of the trend, or they're actually participating in the trend. We also assume that individuals can have different types of relationships which can carry different magnitudes of influence. An important assumption was assuming no individual could go back to being unaware of a trend after they have already become aware or are a participant in the trend. Since we're looking at the changes in mechanisms over time, we assume that the weight of influence for certain types of relationships would also change with the time period we are looking at. For example, a virtual relationship might influence you more now than it did before social media. We also assumed influencers have higher influence on individuals. And finally, we assume that as a trend becomes more popular, it is more likely for a node to be influenced to participate in that trend. Moving on to the initialization of the network, we used a multi-layer graph of n nodes and m edges, where m is n times some multiplier, which varied depending on the time period. States of the nodes were randomly initialized with probabilities, where most nodes were initialized as unaware and some were initialized as aware or participating. Since our network is a multi-layer one, the edges can have different attributes. Here, the different attributes are the varying types of relationships, either physical or a virtual relationship. A physical relationship is defined as someone you interact with face-to-face regularly, while a virtual relationship could simply be following someone on social media. Edges in relationships between nodes were also initialized randomly, where the probability of choosing a relationship changed depending on the time period. For example, before social media, there were very few virtual relationships and it was mostly physical relationships, while now it is almost the opposite. Each edge was then weighted based on the type of relationship, which also varied network to network or time period to time period, because again, before social media, a virtual relationship likely carried very little weight in terms of how you were influenced, whereas compared to now, you're influenced much more by virtual relationships. Finally, some number of nodes were randomly selected as influencers, and these are kind of super spreaders of the trend. These influencers are connected to quite a few nodes, specifically between 40 and 80% of the population, and they also carry a very high edge weight, thus to influence their connections even more. Moving on to our actual model, we used a voter model. However, we modified it into a sort of complex weighted voter model. The mechanisms start off the same way as a classic voter model, where one node is randomly selected, its neighbor states are looked at, and then one is chosen. However, instead of randomly picking a state as the new state, we actually weighted the selection of a neighboring state by the relationship type between the two nodes. Essentially, this is done by increasing the occurrence of a neighbor state by the weight of the edge between the node selected and the neighbor node, and then taking the proportion of each state and choosing a possible new state based off of these new probabilities. We also kept a tracker of trend popularity, which is essentially just the number of participating nodes in the overall network, and this updates after each time step. The chance of selecting participant as the new state for the node is also increased by a factor of this trend popularity. We then ran this model several times on each of our networks representing different time periods and observed the spread of a trend over time over different social structures.
Analysis, we ran our model on three differing time steps, time periods over the lifespan of a trend's popularity, starting before the trend even really starts, 2, beginning of the trend, and 3, on the current day when the trend is in its full magnitude. We ran each of these models on 1,000 time steps, so you can see them much easier, much clearer. So first of all, for the pre-social media era, we can see the number of unaware individuals starts to decrease towards 0 as we approach that 1,000th time step. The number of aware individuals does sort of the opposite and increases drastically as we approach the 1,000 time step. And then, strangely enough, for this time step, we can see the number of participating individuals starts to rise and then starts to decrease past around the 800th time step. When we look at the beginning of the trend, we can see the same decrease towards 0 for the number of unaware individuals. However, there's this back and forth between the number of aware and participating individuals past around the 300th time step. And then for the current day model, we can see the number of participating individuals reaches its peak around 400 to 800 time steps, and we can also see the decrease in unaware individuals. However, the number of aware individuals, strangely enough in this case, remains pretty constant throughout the entire 1,000 time steps. So we saw the most consistency in this current day model, but we also saw an increase in the timing of the trend, that it reached its maximum in the shortest number of time steps. Since the number of edges and average degree of the network increased at each change, we see more connected graphs in which a higher chance the voter model will increase the magnitude of the spreading of the trend.
A takeaway from generating this model is that there are benefits and challenges to modeling physical relationships and virtual relationships. that when collecting this data, physical relationships are generally difficult to quantify, whereas virtual relationships may be a bit easier since interactions are recorded and therefore they're measurable. Although these metrics then are often very expensive to compute and obtain since they're typically very large in size. Using this model, incorporating both relationship types demonstrates that the spread of trends is different between mechanisms, and it stresses the importance of accounting for both modeling when modeling the spread of trends. There's a few future modifications that could be made to this model that would enhance how realistic it is. Implementing the random addition and removal of edges would symbolize people dropping connections at seemingly random times. Physically, this might be friends, physically moving away from each other, or virtually this might look like an individual unfollowing another user. Additionally, modeling the other extreme of this model would be increasing the number of virtual relationships and minimizing physical relationships, which was the state of the world for a period of time during the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, especially during quarantine time. And lastly, creating subcategories of both physical and virtual relationships would allow for more specific weighting of edges. A physical relationship could be a classmate, or it could be a family member the individual lives with, each of whom would likely influence the individual in very different ways. All these modifications would provide more insightful results that are representative of the complicated spread of trends within society.